Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran Pedley. Well, we've just had party conference season, and the Ipsos gang have been out and about in various cities across the UK, checking in on the different political parties and what they have to say and what the atmosphere is. And so on this podcast, we're going to be taking stock of what we learned from party conference season and looking ahead to what is going to be a busy period at Westminster in the next few months. And to do that, I am joined as ever with two of my favourite people to talk about politics with, Cameron Garrett and Holly Day. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Keiran.
Hey, Keiran.
So we were, as I said, out and about. I was at Conservative conference. Cameron, you were at Labour. Holly, you were at both for some reason. So let's sort of talk a little bit about, in turn, what we took away from it. I suppose let's start with the government. Let's start with Labour. Cameron, we had our fringe event, didn't we, with West Streeting and others. How did that go? What was the vibe generally there? What was your takeaways from conference in general?
So my main takeaway is that Holly must be bribing someone that she got to go to both. Then more seriously, I would say it was a lot busier than previous years. We had to queue to get in the pissing rain, which was took a long time. Obviously, they're in government, more MPs, etc. But then the mood was a bit strange, which I think has been picked up in the media, that it didn't really feel like a party that had just won an election a few months ago. It was a bit more somber, a bit they're recognising the challenges ahead of them, etc. And Wes on our panel, Wes Streeting, picked up on the fact that he thinks actually maybe they've got the mood a bit wrong. Maybe they're pitched too hard in setting expectations for the budget and warning the public that things might be tough in the months to come, and maybe they could be a bit more hopeful. And we have seen that come through in our polling. So we only have 35% who are hopeful of what the new government will do. That compares to like a majority under David Cameron when him and George Osborne were talking about austerity. So that's how bad it's kind of fed through into expectations. And then there was also just this wide recognition that the honeymoon is over. It was very short-lived. Aisha Hazarika called it a dirty weekend in Margate, which I think was a bit mean to Margate personally. But yeah, just this mood that, okay, everyone's still a bit grumpy. We need to start delivering. That's how we're going to turn this around. Delivering, and that will raise expectations, was the mood that came across on our panel. Holly, did you pick up anything different?
Yeah, I think firstly, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse that you get to go to both party conferences, but it does help a little bit with the kind of comparability when we're discussing the mood. I completely echo your sentiment. I think I queued for about an hour and a half to get in. Thankfully sheltered from the rain in a multi-story car park with like the most ridiculous concertina queue, but everyone was quite well spirited in the queue. It did change a bit though once you got through into the actual conference area, which was strange because I, like you, had kind of anticipated that at least the grassroots or the membership or the activists would be kind of in a celebratory mood, having just won such a large majority, being back in government for the first time in such a long time. But I think the few weeks in the run-up to conference really kind of made it feel quite gloomy. The media was being dominated with these stories from the leadership in terms of getting boxes at Wembley and Taylor Swift tickets and free suits and things like that. So I think the media agenda had kind of dominated the mood a little bit. I don't think the leadership and the top team had helped much because, as you said, they were also coming across with quite a pessimistic tone. And I think that chimes with some of the polling that we had in the run-up to conference, where I think it was 50% of the public were saying they were kind of disappointed with the start that the government had made so far. And the measure we have on whether the country's going in the right or wrong direction had kind of dropped off a little bit pre-election and had jumped back up again into the 60%. So mood music amongst the public, I think, was also potentially a bit of a driver of that. In terms of our panel event, we did draw a big crowd, I think largely thanks to Wes Streeting, but also our fantastic Ipsos colleagues on the panel. And there were some really fascinating discussions about delivery. I know we've banged on about that on this podcast in the kind of run up to anticipating a Labour government. And it was very clear from particularly many of Wes Streeting's answers that he and the rest of the team know that ultimately they're going to be judged on delivery, potentially willing to take some tough decisions, and kind of struggle through this first year in order to get things underway, with the acknowledgement that the public understand that things are potentially a bit worse than first feared. That comes across in our polling as well. And when Wes Streeting, interesting, was asked by Kelly Beaver, our boss, about the honeymoon period, he said a marriage should be judged on if it lasts rather than the honeymoon, which I thought was quite a good line, actually. Something he possibly came prepared with, I think, knowing that he was going to be asked about the honeymoon. But he and the other panelists were very much focused on, yes, this might be happening at the minute, but we're not massively concerned about it. It's almost like they expected it. They, in some way, have kind of made this mood happen, almost. And ultimately, what he does on the NHS and what other cabinet ministers do on the other priorities for the public, he sees as the more important thing moving forwards. But yeah, a much gloomier mood than I anticipated, and the rain didn't help. But that's what you get when you come up north, I suppose.
Yeah, I think also the point was made on the panel about how these are all bad, pessimistic numbers, right? But we have seen an uptick since the election in a new government. They've slightly got better, some of their stuff around direction around the country, government satisfaction, etc. But if Labour don't keep that uptick or try and sustain that uptick in any way, and that becomes entrenched again, you're kind of facing the problem that Rishi Sunak had, where the country's just moody and nothing you can do will really help overcome that. How was it away from conference, Keiran?
Yeah, I mean, I think Holly makes a good point about the Labour leadership and sort of setting this mood a little bit. They have given public sector workers quite a large pay rise. There were other things going on too, so they've perhaps overcompensated a bit in some areas. I think not being there, probably the biggest takeaway I had was this suggestion. I don't remember exactly when in the week it came, but this suggestion that Rachel Reeves was going to rewrite the fiscal rules as Chancellor. Because I think, ultimately there were two reasons why the public voted for Labour. I mean, obviously everyone has their own individual reasons, etc. But one was change and one was, fixing public services, particularly the NHS. And as much as clearly reform is going to be important, as in reforming the NHS rather than the party, cash is going to be an important part too. And if you're waiting around for significant economic growth, that cash to then be injected, then you could be waiting quite a while. So there's a lot of noise, but actually the substance of that, as we go into the budget, has the potential to be the lasting consequence of this conference. I think the other thing we've noticed, obviously, over the weekend, which is after Labour conference, is the sort of reshuffle, if you like, at the top. So Sue Gray's now out as Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney's in. There are some other staff changes too. I mean, in many ways, this is the ultimate Westminster bubble story. I don't think the public generally will really pick up on it, other than there's a bit of either chaos or reorganisation at the top, depending on your perspective. But I think it is a recognition, isn't it, that things haven't gone well. You don't move around your top team like that if you think things are going fine. So there is a recognition there from Keir Starmer, I think, that that's the case. What impact it will have is ultimately going to depend on how successful they are. To bring it full circle back to the delivery point, ultimately, if Labour can improve public services and also tell the right story, because politics is about campaigning. It's about what narrative you weave into that improvement that they'll hope for. Then that's going to make it very difficult for the Conservatives next time. But as an outsider, it just feels like it's still a party that's struggling for that story, I would say.
So on Conservatives next time, how were things in Birmingham? Cheerful?
They were actually. Yeah,
go on, Holly.
And this is it kind of was the exact opposite of what I expected it to be, having been to both, but then having been to Labour, and it being as gloomy as it was, maybe that made the Conservative conference feel even more cheery than it potentially actually was. I'm not sure. It was significantly easier to get in. The only blockade we had was a man selling joke books, and Steve Bray and his gang, the pro-EU protesters, outside singing some nice songs. But we walked straight in. There were places
I did buy a
to
joke
sit.
book. It was a pretty bad joke book. So,
it was. We can maybe tell some of those on the next podcast.
I think I would definitely get cancelled if I told some of those jokes, to be honest. But we'll think about that.
Yeah, he was the only blockade to get in. It was noticeably less busy, is the first thing. I think you would expect that. They have significantly fewer MPs, right? And the mood was quite positive. It felt like it was a strange conference because we're in the midst of a leadership contest. So anywhere you kind of stood, because it was a bit emptier, if one of the four were walking around, they had this kind of mad entourage around them, like striding down the corridors. In fact, Kemi Bain nearly got knocked out by our Ipsos poster from our colleague Megan by accident. It would have been an accident as they were kind of marching past. So it was a bit
Knockout
of
numbers from Ipsos.
Nice, I like that. It's like a bit of a beauty contest feel with the four of them just kind of parading round with people following them here, there, and everywhere to all of the different events. And they were obviously the busier events because people wanted to hear what they had to say. And I felt like that was much more of the focus rather than any kind of genuine dissection of what had gone wrong. I think from the events that I went to, and obviously our event, there was kind of an acknowledgement that it was a massive defeat, that things had gone wrong, that things needed to change. But I expected there to be more of a kind of forensic dissection of that and figuring out and kind of properly taking that in and figuring out what had gone wrong and what they needed to do next to change it. And it didn't feel like that next stage was necessarily taking place, potentially because they're waiting to see who's the next leader in order to form the direction of what should happen with that. But even in their speeches, there wasn't a lot of that going on. So I think they were very much preaching to the choir in terms of the people that had turned up. There was a hell of a lot of merch, some quite good punny merch, like Tom Tugan hats was quite good. Someone had put Kemi Badnock stickers on apples, which was, I couldn't quite get the connection of that one. But yeah, it was quite a strange vibe for a party who had just lost kind of one of the most significant like landslides in their history, and it didn't feel like that had just happened to that party and the people that were there. I'm not sure if you felt the same, Keiran.
Yeah, I think the Conservatives have overcompensated a bit in the narrative. So we've seen all this polling about Keir Starmer's ratings falling, highest unfavourables pretty much since he became leader, the public pessimism that you talked about. And so I think that for a lot of Conservatives, they can see, because of that sort of bloom coming off the Labour rose, pardon the pun, they can see the path back in their heads. But I think that our Ipsos political monitor in September should provide some pause for thought. It shows that in terms of being fit to govern, 36% say Labour are fit to govern and 18% say the Tories are fit to govern. Tories are seen as much more out of date and divided than the Labour Party. The Labour Party is seen as having a better team of leaders. And so I think that there was definitely an element of, Labour struggling a little bit in early days, but I think the Conservative reputation for government was just pretty much destroyed in the last year. And whatever you say about the vote share Labour got versus seats, which is obviously a whole other conversation, the reality is the Conservative vote share of 24% was a record low for that party, right? So whatever the mechanism is of Labour's majority and landslide win, what's fundamentally true is that the Tories were rejected wholesale on the left and right and centre at that election. And so I did feel like listening to some, not just our panel, but some of the other panels I went to the next day, there was definitely a sense of maybe it was because all the Conservatives were together and this sort of thing, and all amongst sort of friendly territory and that sort of thing. There was an element of like, oh, well, we're not that they're definitely going to win next time. There was a feeling that we can win next time. And I think that actually what's lacking a bit is what is that introspection. I heard nothing about public services or any of the panels, nothing about the NHS. And, there are other topics that the Conservatives will have to talk about in terms of putting together their own voting coalition, immigration, tax, this sort of stuff that appeals to Tory grassroots. But unless they've got a real story to tell on public services, I mean, you can see where the Labour general election campaign next time goes. So definitely a bit of overcompensation. But what about you, Cameron? You weren't there, but what did you take away from it all?
From all the thought pieces and podcasts I've listened to, the main cut through has been that Jenric's daughter's middle name is Thatcher. Twitter was going crazy for that for a while. And mainly that James Cleverly has done well, essentially. If this conference was set up a bit like 2005, where David Cameron was able to come, deliver a good speech, win people over, and kind of squash other people's campaigns, it seems like the media is setting James Cleverly up as having that kind of conference this time round, and is coming out as more of the favourite. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the next few days. Depending on when we get this podcast out, maybe we might have seen another knockout by now. But how that kind of factors into MPs' choices as they start voting, and whether we're going to see a switch from the top. Jenrick's been performing quite well in the first 2 rounds, and whether that's going to conference will have changed anything there.
And the polling that is available on this of Conservative members I haven't got the figures in front of me, but it tends to see James Cleverly slightly behind Robert Jenrick, but not by loads. And there is some sense of at least past membership polling has maybe overstated whoever the candidate of the right is. Now that candidate, e.g. Liz Truss versus Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss did win, but the gap's a bit narrower this time. So that's probably another word of encouragement for James Cleverly, that maybe if he is, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 points behind, say, Robert Jenrick, for example, in membership polling of the Tory membership, that's not necessarily a disaster if you think that might happen again.
And I think worth saying that amongst our polling as well, regardless of who wins, the favourability ratings of the 4 aren't particularly positive. Pitched against Keir Starmer aren't particularly positive, and when asking if they're likely to become the next Prime Minister, aren't particularly positive. So I think whoever wins is going to have quite the uphill battle, but I think it probably will end up being a close one at the end of this
and in
month.
some ways it's better to be an unknown entity at this point. At least you're not coming in with baggage.
One of the comments I made on our panel sort of picked up by GB News, which won't surprise you when you learn what the comment was, but one of the slides I presented talked about Reform UK's favourability rating, which I think was 28% in our most recent political polls, 47% unfavourable, so we should put it in context, very much net negative. But that 28% favourable score was the highest they've had in our political polls. And so the point I was making on the panel is, in this environment where there's a lot of that pessimism that we talked about has returned, Labour's poll ratings are falling, you can't just assume that sort of benefits the Conservatives, particularly given the place that their brand is in, as we've talked about. It's very corporate speak, but you know what I mean? Like, it's very much like people are very much not convinced by their fitness to govern. 2/3 think they left the economy in a worse place than they let on, and that sort of thing. That anti-politics agenda, also represented by the stats I presented that show less than 1 in 5 think either of the 2 main parties keep their promises. That anti-politics agenda could well benefit some of the smaller parties. You shouldn't assume that almost when we look at the 2024 general election result, this is who reform voters are, this is where they came from, etc. Well, maybe that grows. Maybe that hurts Labour as well as the Tories, but maybe that grows in the next few years. And we should also talk about the Greens on the other side, right? We do know that the Greens got their best ever vote. I think it was their best ever vote share at a general election, partly because they were standing everywhere pretty much this time. I do accept that. But we do know that there is this kind of anti-Starmer sentiment on the left, I think, to put it a bit of an understatement, that could grow too. So look, no one's going to predict the next general election now, but a story of this parliament could be that the 2 main parties are sort of ceding support to some of these other smaller parties and independents.
Go on, Keiran, predict it now. What's going to happen?
Well, what's going to happen is
the reform point's interesting though, because I noticed a lot of questions and concerns and talk of reform, both from the candidates themselves and the activists at Conservative conference, but also there were questions, Cameron, weren't there, on our Labour panel, particularly from kind of councillors looking ahead to the local elections and the threat from reform for Labour as well. So interesting that they've become a concern for both sides. And I think also another thing that came up in both from panelists on both panels, if I remember rightly, from Robert Hayward and Aisha Azarika, was about this point about the fickleness of voters, and that in the next 5 years, the sort of seismic shift that we saw for the size of majority in this election could quite easily happen again in the next election. So politicians on all sides need to be kind of really careful, not take things for granted, and understand that voters aren't necessarily slotting in, falling into line in the same way that they used to with parties that they would traditionally vote for.
The other thing that was mentioned to me, which I didn't appreciate at the time, this wasn't on the panel. This was talking to a couple of former Conservative MPs afterwards, was that Reform actually got their highest vote share in Wales. So they got 17% of the vote in Wales in the general election. It's not by a lot. It's not a lot higher than the overall GB figure, but still, it's. I didn't appreciate that, and there's a lot of talk about when the Welsh Parliament elections come up that that could be ripe territory for Reform. Partly because of what I've just said, but also like Labour have been in government there, and the Conservative brand is obviously tarnished there. So it's also a microcosm of what I'm talking about. So I guess with anything, the Westminster media in particular are looking for these signposts, aren't they, during these parliaments about where there's these inflection points and things change. And you can imagine if there was a by-election in a red wall seat, for example, all eyes will be on that, and how Labour do and whether Reform gain. But those Welsh parliamentary elections could be quite important too. In closing, then I guess let's talk a little bit about what we're sort of looking forward to or looking out for. Obviously, we've got the budget, Tory leadership, lots of other things. What do we think, Cameron? I guess I've mentioned a couple of them there, but are there? Let's take this in a slightly different direction. From our polling in the next couple of months, what are you looking at? What numbers are you looking at most of all? What do you think?
As always with me, my favourite numbers are government satisfaction. That's what I'm always obsessed with behind VI. Particularly post-budget, I think that's going to be an opportunity to try and shift the dial and to kind of do a reset if they want to do one and come out more positive. So particularly what shifts post-budget for me is what I'm interested in.
Holly, what do you reckon?
I think pre and post budget, if I'm allowed to say both, because we often do the sorts of things where we test potential policies or announcements or things that they might have trailed or things that people are expecting for from the manifesto. And I know there's been some talk in the media over the past couple of days about some of the challenges that Rachel Reeves is going to face and some of the things that she may not now be able to do that was some of the flagship economic policy. So if public expectations are that those things are going to happen and then they don't, the budget at the end of this month could be a really crucial thing, and that aligns almost perfectly with kind of when the new leader of the Conservative Party is going to be chosen. So their first job, they won't be elected on like prior to budget day, but one of their first jobs is going to be to try and kind of dissect what is in that budget and how they can combat it. So end of October, start of November is going to be fascinating, I think, for what Labour do, and also then what the kind of first Conservative response is. And also our polling on the new leader is going to be great, depending on who it is, because that's always it's good to have a benchmark and see where they're starting from before they inevitably go down.
Well, Starmer was the most popular leader of the opposition ever in his first one. So.
Challenge accepted for the new Conservative leader.
Also, surely the budget being around Halloween time is going to lend itself to some fun polling.
Oh, great puns as well. There'll be some good puns.
We have been doing some good fun polling, as regular watchers, listeners will know from our fun polling correspondent, Holly, who's just seems to be just the person that goes around firing out the
boring correspondence.
I'm glad we're calling it fun polling instead of nonsense polling, which is the other name that's been floated around.
No such thing. There's no such thing. I think I agree with both of you on your things to look out for, but I think the other thing I would mention, because I've got a regular column in the Evening Standard on this, don't you know?
You've never mentioned it before, Keiran.
Is the US
election
election
Standard closed?
That's what. Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of a damning reflection, managing to kill a long-standing institution like that with a couple of blogs. But the US election, I mean, irrespective of my ramblings on it, I do think Keir Starmer's premiership will be tangibly different depending on whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris win. And the reasons for that may well take a while to unwind. But let's say Trump has a second term, there's going to be many column inches, quite a lot of the atmosphere of British politics is going to be changed by that. Whereas I don't necessarily think that a Kamala Harris presidency aids him per se, but maybe it does by proxy by the fact that it's not Trump. But so that is going to be very important for, well, more importantly, the world, frankly. But it will impact the quality or the texture of UK politics. Let's leave it there. Thank you as ever to Holiday and Cameron Garrett for joining me. If you like what you see /listen, here. Please do share on social media, like, subscribe, and all the rest of it. It really does help us out. But for now, stay tuned for some more Ipsos Politics Talk podcast in the coming weeks.